Welcome back. Conflict and instability, ideology, technology and radicalisation. According to the British anti-terror strategy, these are the key factors that have led to the emergence of the contemporary international terrorist networks. The report also pointed out that radicalisation has its own set of causes. The perception of the UK's foreign policy is just one of them. It has been used in the past by extremists to justify acts of violence. For instance, those responsible for the suicide bombings on public transport in London in 2005 blamed the British policy over Iraq, Afghanistan, and what they believed was lopsided support for Israel over the Palestinians. The new British strategy acknowledges that its foreign policy could be a direct cause for violence, but it does not explicitly present a concrete solution. Well, still with us are our guests in London, DAUD ABDULLAH, also in London, Tobias Feakin, and in Beirut's ALASTAIR CROOKE. Mr. CROOKE, foreign policy, is it still the big elephant in the cupboard that the British government has not really honestly and sincerely addressed as a root cause?
Well, I think they have not addressed it. And I think if you look at the first draft of this report, some of the tests in it, of course, were not in the final document, but they tried to put a test of what is a moderate and what is extremism. And some of the things that they suggested to identify what is an extremist against the standard of foreign policy was if they support resistance movements anywhere in the world fighting occupation. Well, I think it not only does this exclude large numbers of Muslims, but it also excludes many people who are non-Muslims in the world who support resistance movements. And I think the attempt to try and define this as terrorism or support for terrorism shows the main problems and the flaws of British foreign policy. This attempt to use a template of extremism and moderation, and that anyone that is fighting occupation must therefore by definition be extremist, and extremist means terrorist. So I do think they haven't worked out these ideas, and that they're out of touch with a great deal of thinking, mainstream thinking within their own country, because many people support, for example, the Palestinian resistance.
Tobias Feakin, is the government out of touch with mainstream thinking over foreign policy?
I don't think there's any denying that that there are links between, UK foreign policy abroad in the 2000s and some of what's been going on in the UK. And I think the difficulty that I see is that the UK government needs to actually explain far more rigorously some of its decisions and its policy decisions abroad. I think that's what's currently lacking, because there's so much mistrust now in terms of government foreign policy due to what happened with Iraq and as we were talking about earlier, perhaps some of the over exaggerations of threats in terms of what was happening in Iraq. So I think there needs to be a clear explanation of what we're doing and why we're doing it abroad, and in that sense, that communication to the public and the international community wide, I think would go a long way.
DAUD ABDULLAH, Foreign Secretary David Miliband said in January that the war on terror has done more harm than good. Is that encouraging for you to hear?
It is an admission of error, and it should be taken in the spirit in which he said it. Because for many years, the government has been in denial of the issue of torture and kidnap and rendition and human rights secret prisons in Eastern Europe. And it is only in recent weeks, since or in the last months when the Brown administration came to office, that we began to see a lot of the truths come to light. So now we understand finally that our personnel were involved, you see, in a lot of these violations, torture in foreign countries. And acts, you see, which resulted in alienating a section of the community. So this is welcome. But let's go back to the whole issue of context too, and some of the definitions and criteria which are stated therein. For example, if one were to question the legitimacy of Israel, that is a form of extremism. So we shut down the academic debate, we discourage intellectual creativity, and we expect, you see, at the same time, to win the argument. You cannot win the argument if you do not engage in the argument. And this is what I think is lacking in the approach of the government.
Alastair Crooke, would you concur with Mr. Abdullah?
Yes, I think what we are seeing is a form of dogmatic closure, trying to define what is a moderate. It hasn't really been very successful so far, but it is an extremely dangerous position to take, to suggest that Muslims that support or believe in some form of Sharia are somehow extremists, or Muslims that would look to a caliphate in some form in the future are extremists. Seems to me to be trying to, if you like, dictate and define how people are and what people must think. And this idea that we've had and we've seen in the past in Europe about trying to say or trying to define what is an acceptable form of shared values has actually led us in the past into very dangerous territory. Much earlier, and I'm not making a direct comparison, but this was the roots of the First Inquisition, was in fact about Muslims and Jews who'd been made to convert in Spain, were being tested to see if they really had absorbed European values. Where are we going to go with this sort of policy? Are we going to subject people to a sort of inquisition? Already you have that at the universities, where people are being checked and monitored by lecturers and university professors who are expected to report extremism to the authorities. Who are these tests and what are the checks on these tests? Where's the accountability for making sure that this is done in a sensible fashion?
Tobias Feakin, is Alastair Crooke exaggerating when he says this is an inquisition?
In terms of it being an inquisition, I'm not sure that I'd totally agree with that. I would agree with the point that we have a real difficulty over language, and that's something that has been consistent in any debate around terrorism, extremism, etc. There are still not defined parameters on what that means, and I would agree it is quite dangerous to begin to set limits on exactly what being an extremist means. I think an underlying point that shouldn't be forgotten, though, is when we talk about all this, is that there are, unfortunately, a tiny minority of individuals who are spoiling it for the majority. And that's not to say that we should begin taking, you know, as you suggested earlier, Orwellian 1984 steps to control the whole population. But it is about, unfortunately, there still being a tiny minority of individuals who wish to seek harm against the majority in this country. And that still, unfortunately, we might be forgetting a little bit in this debate. And there's a point I'd like to return to from earlier on, which is about, I think there is a real danger about the alienation of certain communities in the UK. And that to me is very worrying in terms of, again, if we refer back to the language and some of the shaping of this document. But let's not forget actually that in the last 2 to 3 years, probably there have been more attacks from far-right groups. And what I don't really want to see is that through some of the policy decisions that are made, you begin to see a kickback in the other direction. And that, I think, is inherently dangerous.
Fair point, fair point. Gentlemen, it's been an intriguing discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, DAUD, Abdullah, Tobias Feakin and Alastair Crooke. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.